Welcome to the number one podcast covering Michigan State basketball. The Final Four is not on the schedule. Join Rod and me, Eric, as we dive deep into the Spartans to get you prepared for every game. Subscribe today for in-depth recruiting updates and fantastic interviews with today's important college basketball personalities like Robbie Hummel.
Thanks for having me. I have listened to your guys' podcast numerous times on drives throughout any Midwestern Big Ten city. So I am big fans of your guys' work.
Jay Billis.
And next time, hey, if anybody in Michigan wants a December tea time, call me. You wimps won't show up, but I'll be there. I'll be there and play in the cold. And Izzo will be in front of the fire with hot chocolate.
Coaches Thomas Kelly.
No problem. Glad to be back, man. Glad to be back.
Mike Garland.
Just can't sit there and trade twos for threes. You can't do it. You're gonna lose. Coming down the stretch, you're gonna lose.
And more. You won't find better coverage of Spartan hoops than you will get here. For both the casual and hardcore fan, come along as we take you for a green and white ride. Hey everybody, it's Eric alongside Rod. Here as we approach the home stretch of our Big Ten previews with number 6, the Ohio State Buckeyes. New coach, new team. Sort of sounds like a familiar refrain after talking about Michigan last show. We'd like to extend our thanks to Mike Huntoon, who upgraded from the Draymond Green to the Mateen Cleaves level of support on Patreon. Thanks a ton, Mike, for the vote of confidence. And if you value what we do on the show, bringing you these previews, in-season game analysis, and interviews, head on over to tffinots.com/support to find ways to support the show through one-time donations or on a recurring basis. So thanks again to the Patreon supporters of the Mateen Cleaves level, Bill Church, Brian O'Donnell, Michael Bosnick, Chad Hickey, and now Mike Huntoon. Draymond Green supporters Adam Walzak, Dan Rankin, James Benton, Jim L., David Brame, Paul Marsh, Scott Driscoll, and Daniel Dranak, and all the Scott Skiles supporters on Patreon, as well as Rich Wagenheim and Kenneth Cromet on Substack. Also a reminder that this year, as every year, Rod is making his predictions, 1 through 18 of the Big Ten final standings. And as I mentioned, we're doing number 6, Ohio State now. If you think you can do better than Rod, head on over to your email service. Send one to me, Eric, at tffinots.com with your picks 1 through 18. As a tiebreaker this year, you pick the amount of points Michigan State scores against Michigan. They do play twice. And the winner gets $100 in free apparel from Nudge Printing, our fantastic sponsor. All right, so let's talk about the Buckeyes. Another disappointing year, another year where we predict them to do much better than they did. Chris Holtman just underperformed throughout his tenure at Ohio State. The only difference this year is that the unending patience was ending. And so he was removed before the end of the season, replaced by interim coach Jake Diebler, who was an assistant. And surprisingly, they gave Jake Diebler the job, which I think we were not expecting. Before Holtman's removal, they were 14-11 overall, but 4-10 in the conference. After that, they went on a 5-1 streak to end the season, won a Big Ten tournament game, won a couple games in IT. Definitely looked like a very competent team with, obviously the same players. And so they weren't able to hang on to as many players as they had initially hoped, maybe. But like most of these teams in the Big Ten, some transfer players, some new pieces, and a new coach. And so we'll see what the Jake Diebler era looks like in Ohio State starting this year.
Yeah, we'll start with Holtman. I've been talking about Chris Holtman, being a guy that might not be justified in holding onto that job for, God, it seems like forever, but it's probably been at least 3 years before it finally
on the show. Yeah.
Before it finally did happen. And I say that basically because Ohio State is one of those places, and there aren't really that many of them, but they are one of those places that hit a sweet spot in that the resources are there to do everything in the sport, including winning a national title. Right. Now they haven't actually won one since the early 60s, but they've been to Final Fours multiple times. They've been to national title games. You can do anything you want to do in the sport of college basketball at Ohio State. But yet at the same time, for a coach, there's a luxury element to it if you are of a certain bent, in that you don't have the same pressure that you have at basketball first places. Right. So say Indiana, for example, it's nowhere near that kind of pressure. So it's a great job. It should be a coveted job. You're also the only Big Ten school. I guess you could say you're not the only high major, because Cincinnati,
Xavier,
Cincinnati
Dayton,
in the Big
maybe
12 now,
kind of.
Xavier in the Big East, but those aren't really on the same level. Ohio State is not in a position that, say, Indiana is, where they got to deal with Purdue or
right.
Michigan State with Michigan. They're in a little bit more, and Ohio is a great talent-producing state. So it's a really, really good job. And Chris Holtman has not had a talent issue, in my view. He was able to get sufficient talent. The problem was turning that talent into real and honest production at a level that you would expect. And that wasn't happening the last few years, and it was a weird, weird thing. Not quite sure why, other than the fact that very clearly he was struggling to get his teams to play defense at a level that would be commensurate with winning significant number of games. That was an issue, but it's hard to say, to zero in on any one obvious thing as to why it didn't work. It's just clear that it didn't work. And boy, it really, if you look back, I think I've said this many times here, I think Thad Matta is about as underappreciated and underrecognized a great coach as I've seen during my entire lifetime of watching Big Ten basketball.
Yeah.
And even with the way his tenure ended, it was still, in my mind, better than what they've gone through the last 3 years or so with Holtman. And what it goes to show you is, even in a great job, it's not automatic. You have to have the right guy. And if you don't have the right guy, you're probably not going to win at the levels that you think you're entitled to. So that's what happened there. And Chris Holtman landed on his feet. He took I guess you could say that he took the job at DePaul. So he's got another high major job. It also happens to be a place where they've struggled mightily to win for about 25 years or so now. Yeah. So I don't know whether that's blessing or curse for him, but regardless, he's employed. So he didn't fall too far. But Ohio State then chooses to give the job to Jake Diebler, who had been an assistant on Holtman's staff, I believe had been seen as their primary recruiter when he was an assistant. And he had, as you detailed, he had a strong close to the season. I am generally, as time has gone on, I've seen enough of these things play out. I can't say that I'm a huge fan of basing decisions on interim tenures that are short term, especially when very little is at stake. I think that can have a tendency to not give us the most accurate picture as to what a full-time tenure is likely to look like. Now, there's no guarantees any way you slice it with this one. Jake Diebler could end up being an inspired choice. And I'm not even saying that Ohio State's decision was made primarily for that reason. They may have gotten into the process and simply decided that they had the right guy right under their noses. That's entirely possible. But I do wonder about it. And we're going to see in fairly short order whether that was a wise decision or not. It was, as you mentioned, it was very surprising to me because, again, the Ohio State job should be one that is attractive to lots and lots of guys. So when you look at some of the names that were bandied around in this process before they surprised many people, not just us, by opting for Jake Diebler, Sean Miller, who was in his second act as head coach at Xavier, was a name that was prominently mentioned. Dusty May. And it's unclear to me whether Dusty May chose the Michigan opportunity over Ohio State or pivoted to the Michigan opportunity when it became clear they were going to hire Jake Diebler. I don't know. Chris Gent, who's an Ohio State alum, most of his time since then, he's been coaching in the NBA. He was 1 year assistant under Thad Matta near the end. It was the end, actually, his last year. But he's a very highly regarded coach. He's mentioned with some frequency, has been mentioned for NBA head coaching jobs. Hasn't gotten one yet, but he was mentioned. Then Lamont Paris. Lamont Paris is an Ohio guy. He had been an assistant at Akron, and more recently, he's been the head coach at South Carolina and has done a nice job. Last year, he had them as a top 25 team. Now, South Carolina acted proactively to extend his contract, but I gotta think if Ohio State wanted him, they could have gotten him.
Sure.
Greg McDermott was mentioned, who had been a candidate the last time when Holtman was eventually hired. The longtime Creighton head coach, been very successful there. Those are the most obvious names, and there were others as well. It's surprising to me that they opted to go the way they did, but again, it may have simply been that as they got into the teeth of this, they decided Jake Diebler was the right guy.
Yeah, I mean, the one thing Jake Diebler has on his side, of course, is youth, which if he's the right fit, I mean, they have potentially a guy who's going to, for all sense expectation, he could be there for 2-3 decades. I mean, potentially, right? If he's
and he's an Ohio guy. His brother played, John Diebler, some of you may remember, played for Ohio State. So the connections are deep, and you're right. That's if it works, you've got a guy who probably isn't going, you would think would not be likely to leave. You can never tell with this stuff.
Yeah,
but
sure.
But yeah, that's a reasonable conclusion. But I don't think you can make decisions based on that.
No, it's just a factor.
Right. If that were the case, you'd always hire a guy who's in his mid-30s, right?
Right.
Might not be the right guy. So we'll see. And I'm not negative on him in particular. I don't think we know, other than the fact that he did a nice job getting a group that was not getting it done under Chris Holtman to suddenly start winning games. Give him that, but it's very much a blank slate at this point. So I do think this. I don't see how the leash can be particularly long on this one, though, because he's not coming with any kind of track record. Chris Holtman, people could look at it and say, well, he did a really nice job at Butler. He's going to get this thing on track. And that led to whatever he had, 7 years, I guess. Jake Diebler doesn't have anything like that on his resume. So if he struggles the first couple seasons, I would think there will be pressure to move on, maybe more so than there would be from a guy who was established. You think about these interim situations. I mean, the most famous one in Big Ten country, of course, is Steve Fisher at Michigan.
Right.
But Steve Fisher went out, won a national title in his interim tenure, and then followed it up by dubious means, of course, but by recruiting success. And he had a lot of talent and won a lot of games. What I guess I'm saying is if that type of thing or anything close to it doesn't happen for Jake Diebler, I'm not sure he gets 7 years, but we'll see. I do think, obviously, given where I picked him, I think there's some reason for optimism that his first year should be reasonably good.
Yeah, until we see the track record with his own players and his own system. But he definitely maximized what they had in the last season, and which is sort of goes to show you what that team had, and they just were never able to sort of muster.
Absolutely. Yeah, as I said, talent was never the issue. Look, Chris Holtman put several guys in the NBA. Seemingly nearly every year he was there, he had a first-team All-Big Ten caliber player on the roster. I'm not sure if that's factually true that he landed a guy on the first team every year, but he always had guys who were capable. You had Bryce Sensabaugh, E.J. Liddell, on and on and on. He had several guys who fit that mold, and yet the winning just didn't happen. So it wasn't a talent issue.
Yeah. Well, and I think we point out many times is their defense was so poor, and that was one thing that was surprising, and he never figured it out. And I don't that at some point it's not a personnel issue, it's a coaching issue, right? When you're repeating the same thing, yeah,
and with different guys, it has to be. Now, what's funny about it is that he didn't really have those issues at Butler. I'm not sure why. With a lot of things to do with Chris Holtman, I'm not quite sure why. But you can't deny that it was real, and it was a sustained, one might argue, systemic flaw. And I'm not sure why it happened, though, because there was nothing in his track record suggesting that it would.
It was, and I would say, too, that Holtman never struck me as a guy who seemed overwhelmed by the situation or what's going on. Just he seemed competent, but yet they were unable to get it done defensively. So, I mean, that's just the impression of competence does not mean you're competent. Right. And so we'll see what things are like with Diebler and how they look as far as how they play. All right, so let's go through the players departing, brought to you by the Squeegee Squad of Grand Rapids. As Ohio State cleans house a little bit, you want to make sure your house is clean as well. If you're on the west side of the state, they take care of your windows, your screens, whether it's commercial, residential, a high-rise, whatever the job, big or small, the Squeegee Squad of Grand Rapids can take care of it for you. They have a very large region. They've cleaned out the state capitol. I don't even know if that's possible. They cleaned the windows of the state capitol. So they have a pretty large region. 15% off. You mentioned Final Four when you get your estimate. You can find ways to get a hold of the Squeegee Squad of Grand Rapids through our support page at thefinalfoursontheschedule.com/support. And so we'll begin with the best player for Ohio State and someone who kept him rolling along through the season, Jamison Battle. 6'7" senior, played 3 different teams. Averaged 15.3 points a game, 5.2 rebounds a game, shot 47, 43, and 93. I think he was banged up a little bit last year, but for the most part, he was he was one of their bright spots for the season.
Yeah, as in staying consistent with what we've been talking about, the defensive flaws. Not a great defensive player, but man, offensively, you couldn't argue with what Jamison Battle did. He really bounced back. If you remember, his first year at Minnesota was really, really good on a surprisingly competitive Gopher team. And then the next year, he was hurt a lot. And when he did play, he wasn't as effective, wasn't as consistent and efficient as he had been. Well, he got back on the beam. I mean, you can't argue with his numbers offensively. 15 points, 5 boards, 47, 43, 93. He was a load. And every bit as good, or I would say better than he was 2 years prior at Minnesota. So definitely that was an addition. That was a portal addition that I thought made sense. I thought that was a smart move. There was a good chance if he was healthy and surrounded by a little bit better talent that he would thrive. And that's exactly what happened.
Yeah, it was interesting. That's one of those moves that he turns out he ended up moving to a worse team than, Minnesota is much more successful in some ways, but maybe they wouldn't have been with him. But anyway, moving on then to Dale Bonner, 6'4", a transfer from Baylor. He averaged a little under 5 points a game, 2.3 rebounds a game in a rotation role, shot 33, 29, and 65. Yeah.
Ohio State's perimeter shooting was a little bit short last year, and they would have hoped for more out of Bonner. He gave them a veteran presence in the backcourt, but I think it wasn't a terrible year, but I think they had hoped for a little better performance out of him.
And then departing player, Roddy Gale, 6'4" guard. He's going to play for the Wolverines with 2 years left. And he was inefficient, but productive. He averaged 13.5 points a game on 45, 28, and 83 shooting. So again, lots of potential, just with a little inconsistency from outside.
That's really the issue. There's no arguing with the idea that you lose a guy who has played that many minutes, scored that many points for you. Well, that's a loss. He was playing a significant role for a reason. And I also think that you've got to bring to this analysis in regard to Gale something of which guy is he? Is he the guy that was a 40% plus 3-point shooter as a freshman, or the guy that was sub 30% last year? Because that plays a role. And he does more than just 3-point shooting, but that's a significant thing for any wing, right? I think there's an argument that Ohio State could potentially be better off without him in terms of what they've brought in to replace him if those players are more consistent. But at the same time, it's also possible that Gale is ready to find more consistency as he continues to mature, and that Michigan will now get the benefit of that. Hard to know. It was surprising on the surface to me. I'm still not quite sure what led to that. That was one of the interesting things, and we'll talk about it as we move through this, guys, they've lost. One of the reasons typically that you hire an interim is that, especially one who was considered the primary recruiter on the staff, is I would think, well, okay, that guy's going to give you a better opportunity than almost any other hire you could have to retain your talent. And one of the things that people universally agreed upon with regard to Ohio State's roster is they had a lot of young talent.
Yeah.
So these were highly regarded recruiting classes. So you would have thought that Jake Diebler would have been a great choice to kind of keep the band together. Well, that didn't happen. They lost a lot of guys, Gale being one of them. And it's interesting at the very least. And again, Gale going to Michigan, he didn't go there for an NIL bump. I know that. So I'm not sure why, but something, I guess, to watch as we see Diebler's career unfold. Is he able to retain guys? Because that's a big key as we talk about. There are certain guys who maybe are proving to be more adept than others at dealing with the total churn of roster year on year. But for the most part, I think that's going to be difficult to do with consistency. I think that one way or another, if you're going to be successful in this environment, one of the key elements to that success will be the ability to retain at least a solid core of the guys that you have over multiple years. And so it'll be interesting to watch and see if this was a one-year anomaly or if Jake Diebler has an issue there. I don't know.
Well, I guess you could say probably fairly that they did not have a massive roster turnover that some other schools did. So he probably was able to retain some of his talent, and as we'll go through, they didn't lose everybody.
No.
But also, to your point too, that it's now, I think, instead of recruiting and coaching being sort of the keys for a head coach, now it's recruiting, retention, and coaching. I think that's, you got to have all three aspects of it. So one of the players that lost is Felix Okpara, a 6'10 center, averaged 6.6 points a game, 6.4 rebounds a game, along with almost 2.5 blocks, shot 59% from the field, transferring to Tennessee. So he's certainly a big loss because I think they had a lot of hopes for him continuing to grow at the center position.
That's right. It's not even just about what he produced last year, which was pretty good. 6.5 rebounds, 2.5 blocks. That's strong production. And I think there's reason to believe that he's got more offense to come over his last two seasons as well. Right. That's a loss. I mean, there's no two ways about it. And I think they thought that they were going to be able to retain him because he didn't leave immediately, but that didn't happen. A loss. No other way to put it, because I think he's on track to be a very good player.
Yeah. And then another loss at the center position, Zed Key, 6'9", transferred to Dayton. He was averaging 6.6 points a game, 4.1 rebounds a game, shot 51, 25, and 71. He's obviously injured a lot during his career at Ohio State, and so he's going to take his COVID year to the A-10.
This one is a little easier to understand. Zed Key, to me, I've always thought of him this way, and I think the way his career at Ohio State ended did nothing to dissuade me from this comparison. Zed Key always struck me as a B-minus version of Nick Ward.
Yes.
Unquestionable offensive talent in the low post, but very questionable defensively. And over time, actually saw his role decrease. If you think back to Nick's last season, now there was at Michigan State, there was an injury in there, but he was already losing minutes to Xavier Tillman as that season was unfolding, even before he got hurt. Zed Key lost minutes to Okpara, and largely I think it was for similar reasons. Neither of those guys could ever quite figure it out well enough on the defensive end to justify playing them the minutes that they were getting.
Right.
And so, Zed Key wasn't as good as Nick Ward, but the two situations are, I think, comparable in many ways. So, so Zed Key moves on, plays last year at Dayton. He'll hope that he has a more consistent, large role. And look, one thing the guy can do, he can absolutely score in the low post. If that's what you need and you're willing to live with some other things that maybe aren't so good, he can do that, no question.
Mm-hmm. Next one, a little bit more surprising to me, 6'6" freshman wing, Scotty Middleton. He's transferred to Seton Hall. He averaged 4.4 points a game, but he shot well, 40, 45, and 50, obviously not gigantic volume.
He was the most heralded guy in their class last year. He was a guy that Michigan State recruited for a while as well. Didn't earn a huge role. I think I expected more out of him, but the efficiency numbers suggest that he may actually, with more minutes, be a guy who can really produce. And I would think he's going to have an opportunity to expand his role significantly after moving to Seton Hall. But I can't imagine he was a guy they were anxious to see go either. So again, another loss.
And final departure, Bowen Hardman, 6'3" sophomore, averaged 1.8 points a game in 18 games, transferring down to Akron.
Yeah, but another very obvious move. You're not playing a lot. Your career is starting to tick by. He's halfway through, only plays in 18 games. I would think moving down to the MAC level probably makes sense if he wants to have an expanded role and actually get time on the court.
All right, now we'll go through the returning players, brought to you by Nudge Printing, our longtime sponsor. They're the number one go-to source of apparel for Spartans and all the other schools in the state of Michigan, or should be for you if they aren't. They're favorites of my family. My daughter got a really cool full zip-up like hoodie sweatshirt, super soft inside. She loves it. She also got a jacket, which is a really nice black one with the sort of that script state on the front. So she's super happy. She's got some gear now that she's can walk around campus and look like she belongs in East Lansing. So you can get your own stuff, whether it's for football or basketball, hockey, whatever it might be, at the Final Four schedule.com/support. You can find a link there, or just go to Nudge Printing at nudgeprinting.com. The huge selection there, including his new hats that he's custom made. You get 20% off if you type in Final Four just as one word in checkout. Again, that's Nudge Printing. All right, so Bruce Thornton was one of the keys to get returning back. He was 6'3" junior point guard, averaged 15.7 points a game, 3.7 rebounds a game, 4.8 assists to 1.2 turnovers, so excellent 4-to-1 assist turnover ratio. Shot 43, 33, and 85, so not fantastic three-point shooting, but he also drew a lot of fouls, getting about 4 attempts a game. So, I mean, obviously, if you had to pick one player to bring back, he's probably the one you want.
Yeah, and I think, look, pretty clearly the best point guard in the Big Ten, in my opinion. I've been a fan of Bruce Thornton since they got him. If you remember, he really started to find himself. In the last couple of years, Ohio State had these late season closes that were very strong. And the one they had 2 years ago under Holtman is the way, if you remember, Ohio State took out Michigan State in the Big Ten tournament.
Oh, yeah.
Bruce Thornton was really, really good. And that's where he had shown signs during his freshman year up to that point, but that's where he really started to find it. And he built on that in his sophomore season And you mentioned the numbers. I mean, they're really, really good. This is a guy, good size at the position at 6'3". He's built like a fullback. So strength, not an issue. If you want to pick nits, he had a downtick from his freshman year in 3-point shooting, but at the same time, he was more aggressive getting to the rim. He averaged 4.5 free throw attempts per game, and I think there's room for even more of that. I've always been impressed with his off-the-dribble game, again, because of his strength in part. He's a guy who can finish through contact. He can get a lot of contact, draw a lot of fouls, and he shoots free throws very well. I think he's got everything you want a point guard. Makes good decisions. Turnovers are not a problem. Balanced play between getting his own offense and setting others up, etc. He's one of, if not the main reason I've got Ohio State where I've got them, is Bruce Thornton. If you have a guy like that at the point, you should be in good shape. And I believe that. I think he's a guy you can absolutely win with.
All right, next is Evan Mahaffey, 6'6" junior, averaged 4.3 points a game, 4.2 rebounds a game. Started all but one game this season, averaging about 22 minutes. Not a fantastic outside shooter. He shot 43, 12, and 62. But he's the kind of guy that gets everything else done for you. And he came from Penn State, didn't he? Or am I imagining that?
He did.
Okay,
no,
yeah.
You're right. He came home. He's a Columbus native. Initially played his first year at Penn State and forced his way into their rotation. Played a similar style in his second year after coming back home to Ohio State. Look, there are things that you probably will never get from Mahaffey. You're never going to get a big-time scorer. You certainly aren't going to get a guy who's going to come out and hit jump shots for you. But what you are going to get is the potential, I think, to be a versatile defender. You're going to get a guy who can rebound. He's going to throw his body around, and most importantly, he's going to play with energy. I think if you're looking for Evan Mahaffey to be a fifth option, that's acceptable. You could start him, and I could see him starting for a team if he's in the right role, and I think Ohio State can put him in the right role. I like him. I would like having a guy like that on my roster, just because at the very bare minimum, you're going to be able to use him to hold other guys accountable, because he's going to give you the things that most coaches feel they need from somewhere. Yeah. Even if it's not in the most purely talented body.
He's one of those culture guys, right? He's a guy who
absolutely
maintains your toughness or whatever it might be.
That's how I see it. Yeah.
Yeah. So next is a young player, 6'6" sophomore now, Devin Royal. Michigan State fans may recall Michigan State was in big on him.
Absolutely.
In recruitment. He averaged 4.7 points a game, 2.4 rebounds a game, shot 51, 15, and 71. So obviously he's got to improve his shooting, but especially near the end of the season, he really started showing why Michigan State was so big on him.
Absolutely. I'm a big Devin Royal fan. I think, Michigan State, I think, recovered from that nicely by then turning their attentions to Cohen Carr. And Devin Royal's a very different kind of player. There's an interesting contrast in those two guys. Devin Royal, much more earthbound than Cohen Carr. But he reminds me of guys Michigan State has had in the past. He's kind of an in-between kind of body. He's 6'6", maybe not quite athletic enough where you think it's ideal for him to play on the wing, but he can play there. Not tall enough to where you feel great about him in all matchups, at least at the 4, but he can give you that. Kind of a tweener guy, but I really do like his game, and I think the jumper probably will improve. It needs to, but I think it will. And he's got a nice post game. Just a nice all-around player, and I think I'm going to be surprised if he doesn't develop into a really good starter at the 4 or the 3 for Ohio State as time goes on, probably as soon as this season.
Then move on to Tayson Chapman, 6'4" sophomore wing. He didn't play a whole lot last year because he's banged up a bit. And so we'll see what he turns into this year.
They're still high on him. They think he can develop into a useful player as kind of a 3-and-D guy. He was hurt last year, and I think that affected how much he was able to contribute, but they still think he's got some good basketball in him.
6'10" redshirt freshman big Austin Parks only played 9 games last year, but again, hopefully he can contribute a little bit more for the Buckeyes.
Yeah, they think he's a guy that down the line they have some faith in terms of being a big body who also has some ball skills, can shoot a little bit, can pass. So we'll see if that evolves with some of the roster turnover into a situation where he starts to play a little bit.
And final returning player, Kalen Etzler, 6'8" junior, only played about 7 games last year, and he's just a deep reserve at this point.
Yeah, and I don't expect a big role for him.
As we move along to the newcomers to the Ohio State Buckeyes, just a reminder, the Brothers at Just You Gutters will sponsor a session to which player other teams need to keep in the gutter for the Buckeyes. They only do gutters, and so they're really good at it. They can do small jobs, big jobs, residential, commercial. They took care of my house. They got rid of the tree that was leaving my gutter. They now have it so I don't have to restain and my front door every year, now that I've got gutters in the front of my house. And if you have problems with your gutters or got something you need them cleaned out, maybe you want some leaf guards on so you don't have to deal with that anymore, contact the Brothers Just You Gutters. They cover most of the south part of the state, so if you're on the west side or the east side, they've got you covered. They got great pricing. They get 10% off. You mentioned Final Four when you get your estimate. You can find ways to contact Kurt or Greg at our support page again at the finalfoursnottheschedule.com/support. So check them out. You won't regret it. And it's important to make sure you take care of water in your yard or off your house, so it doesn't end up in your house. Okay, we'll begin with Meechie Johnson. So Johnson's a player who began at Ohio State and left and then came back after going to South Carolina for a couple of years. He had a couple of good years in the SEC with the Gamecocks. He's 6'2". He's averaged 14.1 points a game, 2.9 assists a game, shot 40, 32, and 79. And so obviously they're hoping to get a little bit more out of him from an efficiency standpoint. But he definitely is the guy who looks like more the transfer back and forth kind of guy, which we saw with Mahaffey and all these other players.
Well, this is an example of the modern game, right? This is Exhibit A. So we've saw it with Wahab Kit, big man.
Yeah, right. Kudos, Wahab. Yeah.
Was at Georgetown, then he went to Maryland, then we went back to Georgetown, and then he closed at Penn State, right?
Yeah.
Ohio State will hope that Meechie Johnson stops with Act 2 at Ohio State. He's an interesting guy. He started early, so he came in enrolling early during what should have been his final year of high school, and he played in 17 games. The next year, he averaged 18 minutes a game as a rotation guy, but I have to say, in neither of those seasons did it look obvious that he was going to be that he was going to pan out. He didn't, in my opinion, he did not look great. Then he goes to the SEC and has 2 really good years overall at South Carolina. Now comes back for his final year in Columbus, comes back home. This is basically the replacement for Roddy Gale. That's the role that Meechie Johnson's going to fit. And he's a very different player. He's more of a combo guard, certainly, than Roddy Gale. He's smaller than Roddy Gale, but much more of an on-ball guy. Obviously, with Bruce Horton on the roster, you're not going to have him play point guard, but it's nice to have Meechie Johnson as an option, although I don't know that it'll go that way either. I think they're primarily looking at him to be a scorer from the wing. And so the question's going to be, do you get better play, more efficient play overall, making that swap, Meechie Johnson for Roddy Gale? Obviously, he's a proven scorer. He's done it at the high major level at South Carolina in the SEC. So there's reason for confidence that he'll give Ohio State some scoring punch. Can he find his way to a little more consistency with the deep shot? That's, I think, the main issue.
Then we have Sean Stewart, 6'9" forward, who's a highly regarded freshman playing at Duke. He's a left Duke, and he played 33 games, averaged 2.6 points a game and 3.2 rebounds a game, shooting 57% from the floor and a paltry 51% from the line.
Highly regarded player. And so there's a ton of potential here. The question is, can Ohio State unlock it? Because the production was not spectacular as a true freshman at Duke. So a lot of potential. It's easy to envision Stewart becoming a serious player for Ohio State as a form man. But he's also on a roster where there are guys in Royal and Mahaffey who don't have his athletic potential, aren't as big, but are definitely going to compete for minutes at that position too. I think Stewart's going to play a lot regardless. I think they have to. But where he fits in, how big the role is, that probably is going to be answered by virtue of how efficient he is.
Then we have Aaron Bradshaw, 7-footer, 230-pounder, obviously a replacement for Okpara and Zed Key at the center position. He's an All-American freshman at Kentucky last year, averaged 4.9 points a game, 3.3 rebounds a game, along with a little less than a block a game. Shot 58, 29, 57. Hurt at the beginning of the season, got him into some sort of competition for minutes, and so ended up starting 10 games still, but he'll be, again, like I said, he'll be the starter most likely at Ohio State.
I don't think there's any question. I think they have to.
Yeah.
But it's this is a guy who was hyped going into his freshman season at Kentucky, but I think the injuries sort of made it unlikely that he was ever going to truly live up to advanced billing. And there was also competition for minutes at Kentucky at his position. So those two things conspired to maybe hold him back a little bit. I think one big issue, and I'm not sure where this has landed, we'll start to see in November, is how much strength he's added, because he actually had similar issues in some ways. They're not exactly the same player by any means, but I think there are some similar issues between Bradshaw and Xavier Booker, who was also an All-American in that same class, also a much hyped player, but for whom I think lack of strength was an issue as a freshman. I think that played into Bradshaw's season as well. There's absolutely a ton of potential here. Bradshaw is long, he's athletic. I think they believe he could be a very effective rim protector. Like, they believe he can be an effective offensive player. He's a guy who can get some things done running the floor for sure. Like, they think he can be okay in the post. I do think it's an open question as to whether they're better off or not in this trade, so to speak. And they didn't want it that way. They wanted to keep Okpara and have Bradshaw as well. If I remember correctly, Bradshaw committed before Okpara decided to leave. I think that's how it went. So they wanted both. They don't have both. They've only got Bradshaw. Are they better off than they were last year with Okpara? I think that's very much an open question. But there's a ton of potential here. Stewart and Bradshaw are, I think, the two most important factors in determining what Ohio State's ceiling is going to be this year. If they can come close to matching expectations, at least the expectations that were there for them coming out of high school, Ohio State's in a very, very good situation.
I don't feel like Ohio State has a ton of size. I mean, outside. So you got Bradshaw. Is Stewart someone who can play the 5 as well to back up Bradshaw? Or, I mean, because it seems like they don't have much. I mean, I guess you got Parks, we mentioned before.
They'll
6'10",
have, they'll have they've got a freshman we'll talk about in a minute as well. But the position is there for Bradshaw. There's no doubt about that.
Yeah. Then also Micah Parrish, former Grizzly at Oakland. A lot of Spartan fans may recall him. There's a lot of push for Michigan State to pick him up last year. He ended up going to San Diego State. 6'6" forward, and he's averaged 9.3 points a game and 4.1 rebounds a game at San Diego last year. He shot 39, 29, and 74.
Yeah, and so Micah Parrish is kind of the opposite end of the spectrum from Stewart and Bradshaw. I think Ohio State has a very, very good idea of what they have in Micah Parrish, because he's done it for 4 years. He's a fifth-year guy. moved up to San Diego State after 2 years at Oakland. And as you mentioned, Michigan State was definitely interested in bringing the Detroit native on. It was actually 2 years ago. And he opted to go to San Diego State, was on that Final Four team they had 2 years ago, was on another good team last year. Look, Micah Parrish is not a star, but he's the kind of guy who raises your floor in terms of your roster composition, because he's going to give you a certain level of production that you can reasonably count on, and do it with a veteran presence. He understands how to play. He can help at both the 3 and the 4. Again, he's sort of another tweener. I don't think he's perfect in either position, but he can give you production in either position. Not a consistent deep shooter, but that's okay. He'll give you some rebounding. He'll give you some transition production. He'll give you some putbacks. He can score in a variety of ways. Not going to be a 15-point-a-night guy, most likely, but a nice piece to have, because you can plug him in a couple different spots. And as I said, you know what you're getting.
Yeah. Well, then we'll talk about a few players who are additions to the team who, in the traditional manner, through recruitment. Freshman John Mobley Jr., he played with Jace Richardson a little bit in Ohio, and he's from Ohio.
He's originally from Ohio. He played with Jace at Bishop Gorman 2 years ago, and then he finished up his last year was at Wasatch Academy in Utah. He's a big-time recruit as a point guard, 6'1" point guard, generally considered a consensus top 75 guy. Some had him in the top 50. Again, a point guard, and he can play that position, but he also comes in with a reputation as a very, very effective shooter. So I think they have hopes that Mobley could be a guy who adds some perimeter shooting to this roster, which, if you look at all the guys we've talked about, that is definitely something Ohio State can use. So I think Mobley is very likely to be in the rotation somewhere. His presence is also why they may be able to get away with allowing Michi Johnston to just concentrate primarily on scoring from an off-ball position as opposed to sharing some backup point guard duties. And I think Mobley's shooting may allow him to play off-ball as well. Or they could opt to have Bruce Thornton play a little bit off-ball to get a break and put Mobley on ball. But he's going to play. There's no doubt about that.
And then another freshman recruit is Colin White, also from Ohio.
Yeah, and White is a 6'6" Ohio native, as you say. Not quite as highly regarded as Mobley. The top 150 guy, I think, consensus. A nice contributor at the high school level in Ohio. He also played AAU basketball for Indiana Elite, which is a team on the Adidas circuit, and he was productive for them as well. In the long run, I think they're hoping that he can be another sort of hybrid guy, maybe play some small ball 4, play some 3. I don't necessarily, when you look at all the guys they've got, though, at those 2 positions, I don't know that I would expect him to play a big role immediately as a freshman.
Certainly one of the nice things about having Diebler return as one of the main recruiters for the team, your entire recruitment process just continues unabated. Obviously, the head coaching changed, and so it just mattered with the player's comfort level with the new head coach. But that's sort of the structures, at least, consistent with keeping an interim coach like him. I'm sure that was a small portion. And again, I think that the main considerations for the coaches is probably how can you coach, recruit, and retain later on, and not so much, these sort of things. So final freshman recruit is Evan Jugovan from Croatia.
Yeah, big kid. And so he'll compete with Parks for, I think, those backup center minutes. He's 7'1". Could stand to add some strength, but I don't think it's so drastic that it prevents him from having any chance of playing as a freshman. So he's native of Croatia, and there's reason to have some optimism as to what Jugovan can give them. He was a member of the Croatian under-20 national team, played in the European Championships this summer, and was reasonably productive, 6.1 points, 6.6 rebounds over 7 games. I don't think they're projecting a big role, but one of Parks or Njegovan is going to have to play, unless they decided, as you said, to go with Sean Stewart in there and go with a small lineup. But I think one of those two guys is likely to soak up backup minutes behind Bradshaw.
All right, so now we've gone through the roster for the Buckeyes. I'm going to go on a limb and guess that the player that teams need to keep in the gutters can be Bruce Thornton. Is that who you'd pick as well?
100% has to be. I mean, I think there are guys on this team who certainly have potential. Michi Johnson comes in as a proven scorer. I think it's easy to imagine Devin Royal really developing as a sophomore. And then you've got those two transfers, Stewart and Bradshaw, who have high-end potential as well. But this is Bruce Thornton's team. And anytime your best player is also the guy who's going to have the ball in his hands the most, that's a pretty safe bet that that's going to be the guy that opposing teams put at the top of the scouting report.
Yeah, almost like a Boo Booey sort of, where especially if his 3-point shooting increases a little bit, it's going to be really tough this year. So overall, obviously brand new team, brand new coach. Ohio State, you haven't picked 6th here, so that's comfortably in the field for the NCAA. But there's a lot of questions, as there are with all these teams, right? This time of the year as well. But so what do you think? And I guess the other question is, do you have any feel for how Diebler is going to coach his team? I mean, are they going to play a certain way? Is he giving any sort of hints to that?
Well, I don't think, I didn't get the sense that we saw drastic changes in terms of style.
I didn't either, but I don't know if that's because he's the same players,
I think they were just, it's possible, but I don't look at this team and see obvious reason to think that they're going to be drastically different. Look, Ohio State under Holtman was not a particularly fast-paced team, and this roster does not, at least to my eye, does not look like a team that is likely to be wanting to play a 94-foot game either.
Right.
So no, I don't think so. I think it's more about just getting the most out of the talent that they have, which is considerable. This is a difficult team. I say this about every team we're talking about, but I'm going to say it about Ohio State too. Very difficult team for me to gauge because, yes, there's obvious talent here. All you have to do is look at the recruiting rankings of some of these guys to know that. There's definitely some high-end potential. But how much are you going to get out of them was the way they finished under Diebler, the reality last year that, okay, this guy is actually going to be able to tap into more of what he's got than the previous regime was able to, or was it a mirage? We don't know.
Yeah.
I think this. I've got them here primarily, as I alluded to earlier, because of Thornton. I think when you start with a point guard that experienced and with that much ability, that's a big leg up. And that's why I give them the edge over several teams that I've ranked behind them who, truthfully, if you just total the potential of the rosters, might be as good or better than Ohio State. But I've got to make, when you're dealing with this much mystery in terms of what these teams are going to look like when they're actually playing together, to my mind, it's two things that I look at. One is not a positive for Ohio State. It's you look at the coach, you look at the track record. Well, he doesn't have one. But the other thing is you look at the point. You look at the point guard position. And I think Ohio State having not just a proven answer, but probably the best guy at his position in the entire conference, that has to count for something. And so that's why I've got Ohio State here. The fact is, this could easily be a team that doesn't make the tournament. That outcome would not surprise me either. So my putting them at 6th, do not take that as me claiming that they're any kind of lock to be a tournament team. It's a gut feeling based on primarily the roster potential and having that answer at the point. I think, as I said earlier, the two most important guys to determining what Ohio State's ceiling is are the guys on the inside. It's Stewart and Bradshaw. If those guys can really blossom as sophomores and start to look more like the players people thought they were coming out of high school, Ohio State could be very, very good. If they're not, that could be a problem. You know, the other thing I would say about Ohio State in general that I would worry about is there's not very much in the way of proven jump shooting on this team. You got a lot of guys in the 20s and low 30s from three last year. So that's got to change. They need Thornton to tick back up. They need Michi Johnson to be a little more consistent. If Chapman can contribute and be the guy they thought they were getting when they recruited him, that would help. If Mobley is as good as advertised as a freshman, those are all things that would really help the overall picture. But if you're looking for a weakness offensively, that's a pretty good place to start.
Well, the Ohio State team has definitely caused problems for you over the last few years. As far as picking, you've been off by about 7 positions every year. With them.
I keep picking. Here's the thing: am I wrong, or was the coaching to blame? In each of the last 2 years, I had them picked high. They didn't finish high, but in both of those seasons, they caught fire late, and I think demonstrated why I had them where they were. Again, I'm gonna stick to this. Lack of talent has not been an issue in Columbus. They've had talent. They just have not been able to put the pieces together until late in the season in order for that talent to really show through.
Yeah.
So I'm going to assume that they're able to figure that out a little earlier this year. But as I say, I've got to hedge a little bit at least verbally, if not where I picked them. It would not shock me if this is not a tournament team. That's a very, very possible outcome if the shooting doesn't come around and if the new big men don't really meet their potential. This could be a team that struggles. But I got to go with a proven point guard like this.
Yeah, boy, it'd be interesting too if you have a team that struggles like this. As you know, let's say it really goes badly. You assume there's at least 3 years for Diebler to try and get things straightened out. But if it's just like a complete mess, maybe a very, very short leash.
I don't think.
The second year, you're not going to get fired after 2 years, but you might be that second year. There might be some significant expectations for you.
Look, it happened to Kenny Payne at Louisville, but that was an all-time cratering, and it came at a school that deeply cares about basketball in a way that Ohio State doesn't.
Yeah,
the atmosphere will not be the same. So I think that's unlikely. I also think it's unlikely that they'll crater that badly. Right. I think that a reasonable negative outcome for Ohio State is they don't make the tournament. It's not they win 7 games.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think we'll leave it there. And again, reminder to check out our great sponsors, Nudge Printing at nudgeprinting.com, the Squeegee Squad of Grand Rapids, the Brothers of Just Two Gutters. You can find all that stuff at our support page at the Final Four on the schedule.com/support. So until next time, we talk about the number 4 team, the Final Four is on the schedule. Go Green.